Thank you. My talk is as follows. I'm going to start off giving a bit of background about what job quality is, and then I'll move on to discuss the current context. And I'm going to argue that this issue of job quality defined in the way that I'm going to define it, which essentially is to include the non-economic aspects of work as well as the economic aspects, is set to become an even more important issue as we move forward from the pandemic. And then thirdly, I'm going to discuss a bit about various policy options and also some knowledge gaps regarding how policy might be used to improve working lives. So at least prior to the pandemic, when we heard discussions of job quality, it generally concerned these two core dimensions, that the terms of employment and pay and benefits. So essentially how much a job pays and how secure it is. There's been this kind of growth in certain sections of the labour market of more insecure contractual arrangements, and low pay is of course always an enduring issue. And so this kind of spurred the government at the time to, for the first time ever, to set out a UK-specific job quality strategy. And interestingly, it went beyond those two core dimensions to include a wider range of issues to be included under this umbrella of good work, as they called it. So good work is not just about fair and decent work, according to the reports. It's also work that offers realistic scope for development and fulfillment. So for the first time ever, at least in the UK, things like job design and the nature of work, so how much control you have over your work, how demanding your work is, and social support and cohesion, so relationships with supervisors, managers, and so on. These sorts of issues became in the purview of something that the government is interested in and possibly regulated. And so that's the definition I'm going to work with. And I'm going to argue that job quality defined in this way is going to become a really important issue. So my own small contribution to this research was a recent ESRC project where we set out to do three things to find out what good work is by asking workers or examining survey data about what workers tell us is good about their jobs. Then also find out where is it, what kind of jobs are more likely to be good jobs according to how workers define good work. And then also what's been happening to it over the last few decades or so. So I'll just give you a big kind of the headline findings, just quickly breeze through them because they provide a good framework, I think, for thinking about working lives into the future. So this was conducted on data, the skills and employment surveys mainly, which is a data set that first started in 1986 and was most recently done in 2017. So it's all pre-pandemic, but there was plenty of crises in that time period, although maybe not quite like the current one, to be able to draw some lessons from it. So conclusion number one, that good work is multidimensional according to workers themselves. So when you ask workers what they look for in a job, that by far the most important factor, the fact that workers agree the most on, is the work itself. Things, and then job security is number two. Whereas things like pay and hours and training really come very low down. And you can look at this in other ways by looking at how different aspects of work predict measures of well-being, etc. And it's these more intrinsic factors of work, so about the tasks and the way work is organized, tend to always come out as the kind of the strongest predictors. So when we think about good work and job quality policy, then it mustn't just be focused on kind of insecurity and low pay. That there's a whole range of factors that workers say are important to them. Then conclusion number two, so job quality really depends on the type of job, perhaps not incredibly surprising. So routine and manual occupations tend to do worse across the board. They're not only low paid and insecure, so this is kind of like retail occupations, driving occupations, warehouse workers, those sorts of jobs. They also offer lower scope for development and fulfillment. There are some exceptions to this. It's the craft and caring sorts of occupations like bakers, carpenters, carers, nursery nurses, childcare assistants tend to be quite low paid and insecure, but offer quite high levels of skill use and reasonable amounts of control over the tasks, and they're quite varied. You don't know what you're going to be doing from one day to the next. But in general, the kind of economic conditions of work cluster quite well with the non-economic conditions. Then moving on to longer term trends, there's some kind of positive changes. There's been a big expansion in manager and professional occupations over the last 3 or 4 decades, and these tend to be higher quality jobs, and a decline in the routine and manual occupations, which tend to be score worse on the different dimensions. So the labour market hasn't really polarized, it's generally upgraded over time. Whilst maybe a lot of discussion about job quality tends to focus on the kind of small sector of the labour market where things have perhaps got a bit more insecure. When you look at survey evidence of how workers feel, of how the extent workers feel their job is insecure, there's been no real trend in that. Perhaps the most alarming trends we did observe, that kind of negative trends, is that for the last sort of 2 decades or so, or a bit more, work has been getting more controlled and more routine and more intense for all workers. So, and the amount of control we have over our job and the variety in our tasks, and of course not having excessive workloads and job demands, these are the things which really affect our well-being the most out of all the different factors that make up job quality, and they're all seem to be getting worse. So it's probably not surprising that we have kind of rising work-related mental health issues and things like that. And I'd just like to highlight these because I wish these sorts of trends had the attention that they deserve. So this was all on research that was done in the pre-COVID era. Since then, since the start of the pandemic, there's 200,000 fewer jobs. It's about a 1 percentage point rise in unemployment. It's been a rise in activity, quite a small one, but noticeable. So could argue, should we worry more about the quantity of jobs than the quality? That there's a large number of people who don't have a job. Maybe that's where government attention should be focused, and indeed was focused on during the pandemic, and has perhaps led to the situation where we can talk about only 100,000 fewer jobs because of the job retention schemes and various other policies which kind of cushion the blow, certainly compared to how big the hit was to GDP. So it's the worst recession for, at least momentarily, for kind of 300 years, but the effects on the labour market is minuscule in comparison to the economic impact. So should we worry about the quantity of jobs more than the quality? Well, I'm going to argue, no, not really. I think that if anything, job quality is set to become even more important because of various events that have happened during the pandemic, which I'm going to outline. So why do I think that job quality is an issue that's not going to go away anytime soon and going to actually grow in importance, has indeed grown in importance during the pandemic? Well, reason number one, I think the pandemic has really brought the inequality in job quality to the fore. So here is a figure from a recent publication using the UK HLS COVID waves of experiencing economic hardship by income group. So this is labour income, and those in lower paying occupations were more likely to be furloughed, have their hours cut, and lose their jobs. And it's also revealed inequalities in other ways. in terms of kind of exposure to coronavirus, etc. And so this is one reason why I think the issue of job quality is set to become a really important issue. The second issue, perhaps in some ways more importantly, the pandemic has illustrated that job quality is to some extent a choice. And I think this can be really nicely illustrated by the doubling or trebling of working from home, depending on how you measure it. So here's another graph from another recent publication, again using UK HLS data, which shows there's been this really big spike in the number or proportion of people working from home. And this has been done in a way that didn't cause very much disruption to operations, didn't even really require very much investment. This kind of technology, like Zoom, is quite ancient, really, and didn't have much impact on productivity as well. So there's been research again using UK HLS, which has shown that this hasn't really affected productivity. So this technology has existed some time. It's been possible for a long time, but essentially management didn't really choose to offer this as an option. And so this, I think, has probably raised expectations of workers about work in some respect. So in another study by Jane Parry of the University of Southampton, also using UK HLS survey data, shows that 9 out of 10 work from home workers who have never worked from home until the pandemic want to maintain some sort of working from home going into the future. I can't think of many other workplace policies that enjoy such overwhelming support. In other surveys, workers say they will give up 7 to 10% of their pay in return for the opportunity to carry on or to work from home. Even workers that don't currently work from home haven't even had any experience with it, say about the same. So there seems to be this rising appetite of job quality, holding employers to account for how work is organized, perhaps. And this has obviously led to discussions about other areas of work. So certainly from working from home back, questions of job demands and workloads, which probably weren't really had much before, certainly not in such an open and collective way in organizations. Then reason number 3, the pandemic has brought poor job quality being bad for business to the fore. And this is best illustrated by these unprecedented labour shortages. So we have 1 million vacancies in the UK, which really dwarfs that number of out of work people by a factor of 5. And just wrote here, notice where vacancies have increased the most. Of course, there's various reasons for this, like the actual pandemic impact and Brexit, etc. But these sectors have been plagued by shortages for a long time. And it's been an interesting experiment because some of these occupations have received very large pay rises to get people to work in them. So the classic example is HGV drivers. So this is just taken from a BBC article a short while ago. So the worker on the left is not advising young people to go become a lorry driver because, and citing reasons of working conditions, not necessarily talking about pay, that have very little control over your working time. The driver on the right got a 40% pay rise overnight. So he was saying he was earning about £80,000 a year now, which puts him into kind of like the top 5% of earners, but still wants to leave the profession, still wants to work in another occupation, change his career because of the working conditions. Doesn't have any control over his working time. So thinking about the longer term impact of COVID, I suppose summing up, so kind of been arguing that there's will be or is a growing recognition that job quality is multidimensional and important. So when we think about work, we need to think about the conditions more broadly defined than just pay and security. Workers have always believed this in the survey data we've looked at, but now it seems becoming more mainstream. Organizations, perhaps, at least for more privileged workers or already more privileged workers, are starting to listen a bit more to these sorts of issues. COVID has also highlighted that the conditions in certain routine and manual occupations are unsustainably poor, and that just by giving people more money isn't really solving the issue that makes these jobs not so attractive in the first place. So, and there's generally more of an appetite for regulating the labour market and regulating job quality. So the current government is quite happy to increase the minimum wage at rates much higher than average pay rises. And now we have one of the more generous minimum wages in equivalent countries. And so it's a recent change to the employment bill. And COVID has also introduced various retraining policies to help people get into work or move on to other types of work, etc. And other political parties seem to be moving in a similar sort of direction of regulating the labour market, regulating job quality a bit more than perhaps in the past. So thinking about what form further regulation could take, I think firstly we need to understand what the regulation we have already does to the quality of work. So and policy can be evaluated by thinking about job quality in this more multi-dimensional way. So for instance, we have a national minimum wage, which sets a floor on wages for employees, but we don't really know the extent to which increasing the national minimum wage trades off with other aspects of job quality. For instance, there is anecdotal evidence that employers are intensifying work for those people affected by minimum wage increases by maybe cutting breaks or just making them work harder. Of course, this will have a human cost ultimately at the expense of getting higher wages. We also need to better understand the extent to which existing regulation is actually complied with. So going back to the minimum wage example, we know a bit more about that the Low Pay Commission's own estimates are that about a fifth of employees who are eligible or should be covered by minimum wage increases don't receive it. So I think in calling for more regulation about the quality of work, we also need to call for better enforcement of the regulation. And then I'm kind of sort of arguing that we should think about, at least explore, regulating more aspects of the quality of work, not just the kind of core economic aspects of work, which might seem quite tricky because they're probably less tractable. Things like pay and hours, the contract type are of course all codified in employment contracts and perhaps easier to monitor and to regulate. But to counter that sort of argument, I would point to various voluntary schemes that are operating where that using this good work framework of things like the job design and the nature of work, etc., can be regulated. They're very detailed, these frameworks. So an example is the London Mayor's Good Work Standard accreditation, and other regional governments have their own sort of version of how job quality, broadly defined, can be regulated, and employers, organizations can be shown to meeting certain standards in this quite broad array of factors. So there is some precedent for this. Then I think finally, it's also important to regulate the working life as well as jobs. So far, current regulation tends to mainly be job focused and employer focused, which is fair enough. But I think we mustn't forget the individual in all of this. So I think there's definitely, and certainly going to the future, will be a need for kind of truly universal retraining or lifelong learning sort of approach, because at present things like the Kickstarter scheme and other sorts of retraining policies are restricted just to very young people or to people with very low levels of qualification. So they're more aimed at getting people into work rather than kind of moving on in their life up through the kind of occupational hierarchy. And so I think, it should be the quality of your job should be the main condition of whether you can access these sorts of schemes. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Just regulating working lives, can also help with other societal challenges as well, like making people stay in work and making jobs attractive, not being absent or sick, and retiring later as well. So I think I'll see that. Thank you.